Imagine leading a nation through the wilderness into a land of giants, fortified cities, and impossible odds. Now imagine being the one chosen to take over after the greatest leader your people have ever known. This is the story of Joshua, the man who succeeded Moses and led the Israelites to conquer the Promised Land. But Joshua's journey was far from straightforward. It was filled with divine encounters, stunning victories, and shocking revelations that few people truly understand. Joshua's journey to leadership began not with a sword, but with a promise. Born in Egypt, Joshua, son of Nun, grew up under the harsh conditions of slavery. He witnessed the cruelty of the Egyptians and the miraculous deliverance of his people through the hand of Moses. It was in these early years that Joshua's character was forged. As a young man, he became an assistant to Moses, a role that allowed him to observe and learn from the greatest leader Israel had ever known. One of the first significant moments in Joshua's life came when he was selected as one of the 12 spies sent to scout the land of Canaan. This mission was critical. The fate of the Israelites hinged on the report these men would bring back. While 10 of the spies returned with a report full of fear and doubt, Joshua and Caleb stood apart. They saw the same giants and fortified cities, but instead of focusing on the obstacles, they focused on the promise of God. Joshua's faith was unwavering. He believed that if God had promised them the land, then they could surely take it. This faith did not go unnoticed. While the faithless spies spread fear among the people, leading to a rebellion that resulted in 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Joshua's faith earned him the favor of God and Moses. God declared that only Joshua and Caleb, among that generation, would enter the Promised Land. This was a significant moment, as it set Joshua apart as a man of faith, destined for leadership. As Moses' assistant, Joshua was present at many critical moments in Israel's journey. He was on the mountain when Moses received the 10 Commandments and witnessed firsthand the glory of God. He saw the rebellion of the people with the golden calf and the consequences of their disobedience. These experiences shaped Joshua, teaching him the importance of faithfulness, obedience, and reliance on God. When the time came for Moses to pass on the mantle of leadership, God chose Joshua. In Deuteronomy 31, God commanded Moses to commission Joshua in front of all the people. Moses laid his hands on Joshua, transferring his authority. God himself spoke to Joshua, telling him to be strong and courageous, for he would lead the people into the land that God had promised to their ancestors. But Joshua's preparation was not just about receiving authority, it was about understanding the weight of responsibility that came with it. God reminded Joshua that success in his new role would depend on his adherence to the law. Joshua was to meditate on it day and night, to ensure that he did everything written in it. This was not just a command, but was the key to his success. Joshua's leadership would be defined by his commitment to God's word and his reliance on God's guidance. As Joshua prepared to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, he knew that his journey would not be easy. But with God's promise and the lessons he had learned under Moses, Joshua was ready to step into his role as the leader of Israel. As Joshua stood on the banks of the Jordan River, the enormity of the task before him must have weighed heavily on his shoulders. The Promised Land lay just across the river, but the Jordan was at flood stage, its waters deep and wide. To cross it seemed impossible, especially with an entire nation, including women, children, and livestock, in tow. Yet, Joshua had been commanded by God to lead the people across, and he knew that God's promises were sure. God gave Joshua specific instructions for the crossing. The Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence among his people, was to lead the way. The priests carrying the ark were to step into the Jordan, and God promised that when their feet touched the water, the river would stop flowing. Joshua relayed these instructions to the people, and they prepared to witness another miracle, one that would affirm Joshua's leadership and God's presence with them. As the priests carrying the ark stepped into the Jordan, the waters from upstream stopped flowing, piling up in a heap a great distance away, while the water downstream flowed away, leaving a dry riverbed. The entire nation of Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground, just as their ancestors had crossed the Red Sea. This event was not just a miraculous crossing, it was a powerful statement that the God who had delivered them from Egypt was the same God who was now leading them into the Promised Land. But God had more in mind than just getting the people across the river. He commanded Joshua to have 12 men, one from each tribe, take a stone from the middle of the Jordan where the priests stood with the ark. These stones were to be set up as a memorial at their camp in Gilgal. Joshua explained to the people that these stones would serve as a sign for future generations. When their children asked what the stones meant, they were to tell them how the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the Ark of the Covenant when it crossed the river. The stones would be a perpetual reminder of God's power and faithfulness. This act of setting up a memorial is often overlooked, but it is deeply significant. The stones were not just a memory of the crossing, but a testament to the fact that God had gone before them and made a way where there was no way. They were a physical reminder that their success in the land would depend on their continued reliance on God. Once the entire nation had crossed the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark came up out of the river, and as soon as their feet touched dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place, flowing at flood stage as before. The miraculous crossing of the Jordan was complete, and the Israelites were now in the Promised Land, ready to face the challenges ahead with renewed faith in the God who had brought them this far. The first major challenge in the Promised Land was the city of Jericho, one of the oldest and most fortified cities in the world. Jericho's walls were massive, and its defenses seemed impregnable. From a human perspective, conquering Jericho was an impossible task. But Joshua knew that this battle, like the crossing of the Jordan, would not be won by human strength or strategy, but by divine intervention. God gave Joshua a battle plan that defied all conventional military wisdom. Instead of attacking the walls with battering rams or laying siege to the city, Joshua was instructed to have the Israelites march around the city once a day for 6 days. 7 priests were to carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and then the priests would blow their trumpets, and the people would shout. At that moment, God promised that the walls of Jericho would collapse, and the Israelites could charge straight in. This plan must have seemed strange to both the Israelites and the inhabitants of Jericho. But Joshua did not hesitate to obey. He instructed the people to follow God's commands exactly. And for 6 days, the Israelites marched silently around the city. On the 7th day, they rose at dawn and marched around the city 7 times. As the priests blew their trumpets on the final lap, Joshua commanded the people to shout, for the Lord had given them the city. At the sound of the trumpets and the people's shout, the walls of Jericho collapsed. The Israelites charged straight in and captured the city. This miraculous victory was not just a demonstration of God's power, but a confirmation of Joshua's leadership. It showed that when God's people are obedient to his commands, even the most impossible obstacles can be overcome. But the story of Jericho also contains a shocking detail that is often overlooked. Before the battle, Joshua had sent 2 spies into Jericho, and they had been hidden by a prostitute named Rahab. In return for her help, the spies promised to spare them and her family when the city was taken. Rahab tied a scarlet cord in her window as a sign, and when the city was destroyed, Joshua spared Rahab and her family. Rahab's faith in the God of Israel led to her salvation, and she became an ancestor of King David and ultimately, of Jesus Christ. This detail reveals the surprising grace of God, who can take even those on the fringes of society and weave them into his divine plan. The fall of Jericho was not just a military victory, it was a spiritual victory that demonstrated the power of faith and obedience. It set the tone for the rest of Joshua's conquest of Canaan, showing that success would come not through human strength, but through reliance on God. After the stunning victory at Jericho and the subsequent defeat of Ai, Joshua's fame spread throughout the land. The kings of Canaan heard of the Israelites' conquests and began to unite against them. However, one group of people, the Gibeonites, decided on a different approach. Instead of fighting, they resorted to deception to secure their survival. The Gibeonites, who were actually neighbors of the Israelites, disguised themselves as ambassadors from a distant land. They wore old clothes, carried moldy bread, and used cracked wineskins to convince Joshua and the Israelites that they had come from a far country. They requested a treaty of peace, claiming they had heard of the mighty deeds of the God of Israel and wanted to make a covenant with his people. Joshua and the leaders of Israel were taken in by the ruse. Without seeking counsel from the Lord, they made a treaty with the Gibeonites, promising to let them live. 3 days later, the truth was revealed. The Israelites discovered that the Gibeonites were their neighbors, living within the land they were supposed to conquer. This incident was a turning point in Joshua's leadership. The treaty with the Gibeonites was binding, even though it had been obtained through deceit. Joshua and the leaders honored their oath, but made the Gibeonites servants, cutting wood and carrying water for the congregation and the altar of the Lord. The story of the Gibeonite deception reveals several important lessons. First, it shows the importance of seeking God's guidance in all decisions. Joshua's failure to consult the Lord led to a compromise that had long-lasting consequences. Second, it demonstrates God's mercy. Despite their deception, the Gibeonites were spared, and they became part of the community of Israel. In fact, later in the Bible, we see that the Gibeonites remained faithful to their covenant with Israel, and God blessed them for it. The Gibeonite deception also highlights the challenges of leadership. Joshua was faced with a difficult decision: break the oath and destroy the Gibeonites, or honor the treaty and live with the consequences. Joshua chose the latter, showing his integrity and commitment to keeping his word, even when it was inconvenient. This decision preserved Israel's integrity before God and the nations around them. In the end, the Gibeonite deception served as a reminder to Joshua and the Israelites that their success in the Promised Land depended on their relationship with God. They could not rely solely on their own wisdom or strength. They needed God's guidance every step of the way. As Joshua grew older, the time came for him to give his final charge to the people of Israel. After years of conquest, the land was largely subdued, and the tribes had received their inheritance. But Joshua knew that the real challenge lay ahead. The people were now settled in the land, surrounded by the remnants of the Canaanite nations, and the temptation to follow other gods was great. In his farewell address, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel at Shechem, the place where God had first appeared to Abraham, and promised to give his descendants the land. Joshua reminded the people of all that God had done for them, from the time of Abraham to their deliverance from Egypt and their conquest of the Promised Land. He recounted how God had driven out the nations before them, not by their sword or bow, but by his power alone. Joshua's message was clear. The people were to fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. He called on them to throw away the gods their ancestors had worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord alone. Then he issued a challenge that has echoed through the centuries. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua 24:15. The people responded with a resounding affirmation of their commitment to the Lord. They declared that they would serve the Lord and obey Him, remembering all the great things He had done for them. Joshua then made a covenant with the people that day, setting up a large stone as a witness to their commitment. He told them that the stone had heard all the words the Lord had spoken to them, and it would be a witness against them if they were unfaithful to God. Joshua's final charge was not just a call to faithfulness, it was a warning. He knew the human heart's tendency to stray and the dangers of complacency. He urged the people to cling to the Lord, to love Him, and to obey His commands, for that was the key to their continued success in the land. After giving his final charge, Joshua died at the age of 110. He was buried in the land of his inheritance, in the hill country of Ephraim. The Bible records that Israel served the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime, and the elders who outlived him. But after that generation passed away, the Israelites began to stray, leading to the dark period of the Judges. Joshua's life and leadership left an indelible mark on the history of Israel. He was a man of faith, courage, and obedience, who led the people into the promised land and established them there. His story is a powerful reminder of the importance of trusting in God's promises, seeking His guidance, and living a life of faithfulness to Him. If Joshua's journey has inspired you, there's so much more to discover in the Bible's incredible stories. Each one holds lessons, challenges, and truths that can transform our lives today. Don't miss out on these life-changing insights. Subscribe to our channel now and join us as we continue to explore the Bible's most fascinating stories, uncover hidden truths, and grow together in faith